The torrential rains came without warning, transforming the peaceful creek that divided the town of Silverwater, Colorado, into a raging monster that swallowed everything in its path. Vaughn Turner watched in horror from the hillside as the floodwaters rose, threatening not just the town but the small white chapel where Daisy O'Malley, a woman he had admired from afar for months, was supposed to be getting married that very day to a man he knew didn't deserve her. It was 1878, and the spring had brought more rain than anyone in Silverwater had seen in decades. Vaughn had come to Colorado 5 years earlier, after the war between the states had left him with nothing but nightmares and an aching emptiness. At 32, he'd built a respectable life as the owner of the town's most successful freight company, but he'd kept to himself, rarely participating in town gatherings or celebrations, except when it came to Daisy O'Malley. The schoolteacher had arrived in Silverwater 2 years ago, bringing light and warmth to the frontier town with her gentle manner and unwavering kindness. At 26, she'd quickly become beloved by everyone, especially the children she taught. Vaughn had fallen for her the moment he'd seen her helping a young boy who had fallen in the street, dusting him off and offering a handkerchief for his tears. Her auburn hair had caught the sunlight, and her smile had reached all the way to her emerald eyes. But Vaughn had never acted on his feelings. A man with his past had no business pursuing a woman like Daisy. So he'd watched, heartbreaking, as she'd accepted the courtship of Edwin Preston, the banker's son who had returned from back east with fine clothes and finer words. Today was to be their wedding day. But as Vaughn stared at the raging waters below, he knew something was terribly wrong. The bridge to the chapel had been washed away, and he could see figures moving frantically around the small white building that now stood like an island in the churning flood. Without hesitation, Vaughn mounted his horse, a sturdy palomino named Thunder, and urged him down the hillside. He'd spent years navigating the treacherous mountain passes with his freight wagons. If anyone could find a way across those waters, it was him. As he approached the edge of the floodwaters, he could see several townspeople gathered, pointing and shouting toward the chapel. "The bride's still in there," Sheriff Mills called out when he spotted Vaughn. Preston and his family made it out before the bridge collapsed, but Daisy and her maid were still getting ready. "They're trapped," Vaughn's heart hammered against his ribs. "Has anyone tried to reach them?" "Waters are too strong," the sheriff replied grimly. "We've been trying to figure out a way across," but Vaughn was already dismounting, his eyes scanning the landscape. There was a narrower section of the flood about 50 yards upstream where an old oak had partially fallen, its massive trunk creating a potential crossing point. "I'm going after her," he announced, stripping off his coat and hat. "Turner, that's suicide," the sheriff protested, but Vaughn was already moving, leading Thunder carefully along the bank toward the fallen oak. The rushing water roared in his ears, drowning out the shouts behind him. All he could think about was Daisy, trapped and frightened, waiting for help that hadn't come. When he reached the tree, he tested its stability. It shifted slightly but held firm against the current. Taking a deep breath, he led Thunder onto the massive trunk. The horse resisted at first, but years of trust between them won out, and they began the treacherous crossing. Water sprayed around them, soaking Vaughn to the skin as he carefully guided Thunder across. Twice, the horse's hooves slipped, nearly sending them both into the churning waters below, but each time they recovered. By the time they reached the other side, Vaughn's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear anything else. He mounted Thunder again and rode the short distance to the chapel, where water had already begun seeping under the doors. He dismounted and splashed through ankle-deep water to the entrance. "Hello," he called, pushing open the door. "Miss O'Malley, is anyone here?" A frightened voice called back from the small side room used as the bridal chamber. "We're here. The water's coming in." Vaughn waded through the chapel, past rows of decorated pews now starting to float in the rising water. When he reached the bridal chamber, he found Daisy and her maid, Martha, standing on chairs to stay above the water that had already risen several inches inside the room. Daisy's wedding dress, a beautiful creation of white satin and lace, was gathered in her hands to keep it from the floodwaters. Her face was pale with fear, but her eyes widened with recognition when she saw him. "Mr. Turner, how did you—" "There's no time," he interrupted. "The chapel won't hold much longer against this flood. We need to leave now." Martha was older, in her 50s, and terrified of the water. "I can't swim," she whispered, her hands trembling. "You won't have to," Vaughn assured her. "I have my horse outside, but we need to hurry." He helped Martha down from her chair first, supporting her as they waded through the rising water. When they reached Thunder, he helped her onto the saddle. "Hold tight to the saddle horn," he instructed. "I'm going back for Miss O'Malley." When he returned to the bridal chamber, Daisy was still perched on her chair, her wedding dress now dark with water at the hem despite her efforts. "Where's Edwin?" she asked as Vaughn approached. "Is he coming with help?" Something in Vaughn's expression must have answered her question because her face fell. "He made it across before the bridge collapsed," Vaughn explained gently. "He's safe on the other side." "And he didn't." Her voice trailed off. "There's no safe way across except the route I found," Vaughn said, not wanting to confirm what they both knew, that her fiancé had made no attempt to come back for her. "We need to go now, Miss O'Malley. The water's rising fast." He reached up to help her down, and she placed her hands on his shoulders. As he lifted her from the chair, their eyes met, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The building groaned around them as the floodwaters pushed against its foundations. "We have to hurry," Vaughn urged, taking her hand. Together they waded through the chapel, now knee-deep in swirling water. Outside, Thunder stood nervously with Martha clinging to the saddle. "I'll take Martha across first," Vaughn decided, "then come back for you." "No," Daisy said firmly. "The water's rising too quickly. We need to stay together." She was right. In the short time they'd been inside, the water had risen significantly, now swirling around the chapel steps. "Can Thunder carry all three of us?" she asked. Vaughn looked at his horse doubtfully. "Not across that tree bridge. It's too narrow and the weight would be too much." He made a quick decision. "Martha will ride. You'll have to hold on to me." He turned to Daisy. "Your dress will make this difficult." Without hesitation, Daisy reached down and tore away the sodden bottom portion of her wedding gown, leaving it at a more manageable length around her knees. "Problem solved," she said with a determination that made Vaughn's admiration for her grow even stronger. He helped Martha adjust her seat on Thunder, then mounted behind her. Reaching down, he lifted Daisy up, positioning her sideways across his lap, one arm securely around her waist. "Hold tight," he instructed both women as he urged Thunder forward. The water had risen even higher, now flowing over parts of the oak tree that had been dry during their crossing. Thunder moved cautiously, sensing the danger. Vaughn kept his focus divided between guiding his horse and holding Daisy securely. Halfway across, disaster struck. A large branch carried by the current slammed into the tree, causing it to shift. Thunder whinnied in fear, his hooves scrambling for purchase. "Steady, boy," Vaughn murmured, feeling Daisy's arms tighten around his neck. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed they would all be swept away. Then Thunder found his footing again, and they continued their precarious journey. When they finally reached the other bank, a cheer went up from the townspeople who had gathered to watch. Hands reached up to help Martha down, and then Daisy. Vaughn dismounted last, his legs shaky with relief. Edwin Preston pushed his way through the crowd, his expensive suit pristine and dry. "Daisy, thank God you're safe." He reached for her but stopped short when he saw the state of her dress, torn and mudded. Daisy looked at him with new eyes. "You didn't come for me," she said quietly. The bridge was gone," he stammered. "There was no way across." "Mr. Turner found a way," she replied, her voice steady. Edwin's face flushed. "That was reckless and foolish. You could have been killed." "But we weren't," Daisy said. She turned to Vaughn, who stood quietly with Thunder's reins in his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. You risked your life to save ours." Vaughn nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she said softly. "You did." The moment was interrupted by Sheriff Mills. "The whole town's going to be underwater soon. We need to move to higher ground." In the chaos that followed the evacuation to the hills above town, the setting up of temporary shelters, the accounting of all the townspeople. Vaughn lost track of Daisy. It wasn't until evening, with rain still falling steadily, that he saw her again. She was sitting alone at the edge of the camp, a blanket around her shoulders, staring out at the distant lights of lanterns where men were working to secure what property they could. "Miss O'Malley," he said, approaching cautiously. "Are you all right?" She looked up, her face pale in the gathering darkness. "Mr. Turner, yes, I'm alive, thanks to you." He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm sorry about your wedding." She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not," she finally said. "I think perhaps the flood saved me from making a terrible mistake." Vaughn didn't know how to respond to that, so he remained silent. "He didn't even try to come for me," she continued. "When I needed him most, he thought only of himself." She turned to look at Vaughn directly. "While you, a man I barely know, risked everything." "I know you better than you might think," Vaughn said before he could stop himself. She tilted her head questioningly. "I mean," he fumbled, "I've seen you with your students, how patient you are with them, how you stayed late to help young Henry Williams learn his letters when everyone else had given up on him." "You noticed that?" she asked, surprised. Vaughn looked down at his hands. "I notice a lot about you, Miss O'Malley." A small smile touched her lips. "I think, after today, you might call me Daisy." Their conversation was interrupted by one of the town councilmen calling for everyone's attention. The news wasn't good. The flood had damaged or destroyed most of the buildings in the lower part of town, including the schoolhouse where Daisy taught. It would be weeks, maybe months, before everything could be rebuilt. "What will you do now?" Vaughn asked her after the meeting dispersed. Daisy sighed. "I don't know. I had rooms above the millinery shop, but that's gone now too." "My home is on the North Ridge," Vaughn said. "It wasn't touched by the flood. I have a spare room. That is, if you'd feel comfortable." He trailed off, realizing how inappropriate his offer might seem, but Daisy surprised him. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Turner." "Vaughn," he corrected gently. "If I'm to call you Daisy," she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes despite the circumstances. "Vaughn, then." The next morning, Vaughn helped Daisy settle into his home, a solidly built cabin with a spectacular view of the mountains. It was simple but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a main living area, and a kitchen. The spare room had been his office, but he quickly cleared it out, moving his desk and papers to a corner of the living room. "This is lovely," Daisy said, standing at the window that looked out over the valley. "You must love waking up to this view every day." "I do," Vaughn admitted, "though I don't often take the time to appreciate it properly." Over the next few days, as the town began the long process of recovery, they fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Vaughn would leave early to help with the cleanup and salvage efforts, while Daisy organized the makeshift school for the children of Silverwater in a tent on the high ground where many families were still camped. In the evenings, they would share simple meals and talk. Vaughn learned that Daisy had come west after losing her parents, seeking a fresh start and adventure. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, her love of books, and her dream of someday starting a proper library in Silverwater. In turn, Vaughn found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone about his time in the war, the farm in Virginia he'd lost, and his journey west. He told her about building his freight business from nothing, about the routes he'd discovered through the mountains that shaved days off the journey to Denver. "You're quite remarkable, Vaughn Turner," Daisy said one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "I don't think I ever really saw you before." Vaughn felt his face warm. "I kept to myself mostly." "Why?" she asked directly. He considered his answer carefully. "After the war, I didn't much like the man I'd become, didn't figure others would either. And now I'm not so sure," he admitted. "Being around you makes me want to be better." Her hand found his in the gathering darkness, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars appeared one by one above the mountains. Edwin Preston appeared at Vaughn's door 3 days later, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Daisy was at the camp teaching, and Vaughn had returned home early to repair a broken shutter. "Preston," Vaughn acknowledged coolly. "Turner." Edwin removed his hat, twisting it in his hands. "I've come to speak with Daisy. She's not here." Edwin's face tightened with disapproval. "This arrangement is highly inappropriate. People are talking." Vaughn crossed his arms. "People can talk all they want. Miss O'Malley needed a place to stay, and I had room." "She was to be my wife," Edwin insisted. "Her place is with me." "That's for her to decide, isn't it?" Edwin stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What are your intentions toward her, Turner? Because if you think you can take advantage of this situation," Vaughn's patience snapped. "My intentions? Where were your intentions when she was trapped in that chapel?" "I didn't see you swimming across that flood to save her." Edwin flushed deep red. "I was going to get help. And yet I'm the one who went after her," Vaughn replied evenly. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Daisy appeared on a borrowed mare, her face flushed from the ride and her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked beautiful and alive in a way Vaughn had never seen her before the flood. Her smile faded when she saw Edwin. "What are you doing here?" Edwin quickly assumed a more pleasant expression. "Daisy, my dear, I've come to take you home." She dismounted, handing the reins to Vaughn with a brief, grateful smile. "Home? I wasn't aware I had one anymore. My family's house was untouched by the flood. You can stay with us until—" He glanced at Vaughn. "Until more suitable arrangements can be made." "I have suitable arrangements," Daisy replied firmly. Edwin lowered his voice, though not enough that Vaughn couldn't hear. "Daisy, you can't stay here with him. It's scandalous. Think of your reputation." Daisy straightened her shoulders. "My reputation? Edwin, you left me to drown on our wedding day." "That's not fair. The bridge was out. While you stood safely on dry land, Vaughn crossed those same floodwaters to save me," she interrupted. "He carried me through those waters when you wouldn't even get your boots wet." Edwin's face hardened. "So that's it. You're throwing away everything we planned because of one moment." "Sometimes one moment shows you everything you need to know about a person," Daisy said quietly. "I'm sorry, Edwin, but I can't marry you. Not now, not ever." Edwin looked from Daisy to Vaughn, his expression darkening. "You'll regret this," he warned before jamming his hat back on his head and storming to his waiting horse. After he'd gone, Daisy let out a long, shaky breath. "Well, that's done. Are you all right?" Vaughn asked gently. She nodded. "Strangely, yes, I feel free." She looked up at him with a small smile. "Thank you for letting me stay here. I know it can't be easy having your space invaded." "I like having you here," Vaughn admitted. "The house feels more like a home with you in it." Her eyes widened slightly at his words, and for a moment Vaughn worried he'd said too much. But then she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made his heart skip a beat. "I like being here too," she said softly. As spring turned to summer, the town of Silverwater slowly rebuilt. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind mud and debris, but also a community drawn closer by shared adversity. Vaughn's freight business became essential to the reconstruction, bringing in supplies from Denver and beyond. Daisy continued to stay at Vaughn's home, despite the occasional raised eyebrow or whispered comment. She made it clear to anyone who asked that they had separate rooms and that Vaughn had been nothing but a gentleman. Besides, with housing still scarce, many unusual living arrangements had become necessary in the aftermath of the flood. What neither of them spoke about openly was the growing connection between them. It was in the small things, the way Vaughn would make sure there were fresh wildflowers on the kitchen table when Daisy returned from teaching, the way she would leave notes in his lunch pail when he made long hauls to Denver, the way their hands would occasionally brush as they worked together in the evenings. One night in early July, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching a summer storm roll in across the mountains. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and distant lightning illuminated the clouds. "I love storms," Daisy said, hugging her knees to her chest. "At least when I'm safely dry and watching from a distance," Vaughn chuckled. "I think you've earned the right to be wary of water for a while." She turned to look at him, her expression suddenly serious. "I never properly thanked you, did I, for saving my life that day?" "You don't need to thank me," Vaughn replied. "I couldn't have done anything else." "But you could have," she insisted. "Anyone else would have. Everyone else did." She reached out and placed her hand on his. "Why did you come for me, Vaughn? The truth." Thunder rumbled in the distance as Vaughn considered his answer. In that moment, with her eyes fixed on his and her hand warm against his skin, he couldn't bring himself to offer anything but honesty. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of a world without you in it," he said quietly. "I've been watching you since the day you arrived in Silverwater, Daisy. Your kindness, your strength, the way you light up any room you enter. I never thought I had any right to speak of it, especially after you agreed to marry Preston, but I couldn't let you die in that chapel without at least trying to save you." Daisy's eyes glistened in the dim light. "Why didn't you ever say anything? Before Edwin, I mean." Vaughn looked down at their joined hands. "What did I have to offer a woman like you? I'm just a freight man with a past full of shadows." "You have everything to offer," she whispered, moving closer. "Everything that matters." The first drops of rain began to fall as Vaughn looked up to meet her gaze. The air between them seemed charged with more than just the approaching storm. "Daisy," he breathed, hardly daring to hope. She answered by leaning forward and pressing her lips gently to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But when Vaughn's hand came up to cradle her face, it deepened into something more certain, more powerful. The rain began to fall in earnest, but neither of them moved to go inside. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless and damp from the rain blowing onto the porch. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you carried me through those floodwaters," Daisy confessed, her hand resting against his chest. "Maybe even before, though I didn't recognize it then." Vaughn covered her hand with his own. "I've loved you since the first time I saw you smile," he admitted. "I just never thought you'd smile that way for me." Lightning flashed, illuminating her face, the wonder in her eyes, the flush in her cheeks, the gentle curve of her lips as she smiled at him now. "Well, Mr. Turner," she said softly, "it seems we have a lot of time to make up for." As summer progressed, their relationship blossomed openly. The town of Silverwater, still recovering from the flood, had more important matters to concern themselves with than the romance between the freight man and the schoolteacher. Those who did notice mostly approved Vaughn's heroism during the flood had elevated him in the eyes of many, and Daisy had always been well loved. By August, the new schoolhouse was nearly complete, built on higher ground this time. Vaughn had donated lumber and transportation for the building materials, working alongside the other men of the town during construction. Daisy spent her days organizing books and supplies for the coming school year and her evenings with Vaughn. On a warm evening in late August, Vaughn took Daisy on a picnic to a meadow high above the town, where wildflowers still bloomed in vibrant patches among the grasses. They spread a blanket beneath a lone pine tree and unpacked the basket Daisy had prepared. "It's so beautiful up here," Daisy sighed, looking out over the valley where Silverwater lay, now largely rebuilt. The creek that had caused such devastation had returned to its normal, peaceful state, winding like a silver ribbon through the landscape. "Not as beautiful as you," Vaughn said, earning a laugh and a playful swat from Daisy. "That's terribly cliché, Mr. Turner," she teased. "Doesn't make it any less true," he replied, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. They ate their simple meal as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. When they had finished, Vaughn grew uncharacteristically quiet. "Is something wrong?" Daisy asked, noticing his distraction. Vaughn shook his head. "No, nothing's wrong. Everything's right, in fact, more right than I ever thought my life could be." He took a deep breath. "Daisy, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life." Her expression softened. "Mine too. I know it hasn't been long since everything that happened," he continued carefully. "And I don't want to rush you, but I also don't want to waste any more time." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment." Daisy's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small, perfect diamond at its center. "It's not as fancy as what Preston gave you," Vaughn said apologetically. "But it's perfect," Daisy interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. Vaughn took her hand. "Daisy O'Malley, I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Daisy's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Vaughn Turner, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the last rays of sunlight and scattering them like tiny stars. Daisy threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him backward onto the blanket. Her kiss was joyful and passionate, and Vaughn responded in kind, holding her close as if she might disappear if he let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you, Daisy, I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this decision." She placed her hand against his cheek. "The only thing I would ever regret is not having met you sooner." They were married on a bright September day, exactly 6 months after the flood that had changed their lives. The ceremony was held in the newly rebuilt chapel, filled with wildflowers and the warm wishes of the entire town. Daisy wore a simple dress of ivory satin, far less elaborate than her previous wedding gown but infinitely more meaningful. As she walked down the aisle toward Vaughn, her face radiant with happiness, he thought his heart might burst with love. Sheriff Mills, who had known Vaughn since his arrival in Silverwater, leaned in as Daisy approached and whispered, "You're a lucky man, Turner, though I reckon luck had nothing to do with it. You earned this happiness." Vaughn couldn't disagree. As he took Daisy's hands in his, he felt a sense of completeness he had never known before. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but the emotion behind them was anything but ordinary. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the gathered townspeople nearly raised the newly constructed roof. The celebration afterward was a joyous affair, with music and dancing lasting well into the night. It became not just a wedding celebration, but a commemoration of the town's rebirth after the flood, a symbol of how disaster could sometimes lead to unexpected blessings. Later that night, when they returned to their home, now truly theirs together, Vaughn swept Daisy into his arms at the threshold. "What are you doing?" she laughed, her arms circling his neck. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he replied with a grin. "It's tradition." "Ah, but this isn't the first time you've carried me, is it?" she said softly, her eyes holding his. Vaughn's expression grew tender. "No, and I suspect it won't be the last. I'll carry you whenever you need me to, Daisy Turner, for all the days of our lives." As he crossed the threshold with his precious burden, Vaughn reflected on how a moment of tragedy had led to his greatest joy. He had gone into those floodwaters to save a woman he admired from afar, only to discover that she was more precious to him than any treasure he could imagine. In the years that followed, Vaughn and Daisy Turner became pillars of the Silverwater community. Vaughn's freight business expanded to include a general store in town, while Daisy continued teaching and eventually established the library she had always dreamed of, housed in a wing added to the schoolhouse. 2 years after their wedding, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Hannah, who inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady determination. A son, Henry, followed 3 years later, a robust boy with a curious mind and adventurous spirit. Each year on the anniversary of the flood, the Turners would make a private pilgrimage to the creek that had once nearly taken Daisy's life, but had ultimately brought them together. They would stand hand in hand on the bridge that had been rebuilt, stronger than before, just as their lives had been. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the flood hadn't come that day?" Daisy asked on one such anniversary, their children playing nearby under the watchful eye of Martha, who had become a dear friend and occasional helper with the children. Vaughn considered the question, watching the now peaceful waters flow beneath the bridge. "I try not to dwell on what might have been," he finally said, "but I do know that I would have found my way to you somehow, even if it took longer, even if the path was different. Some things are just meant to be." Daisy leaned against his shoulder, her hand still fitting perfectly in his after all these years. "I believe that too, though I'm grateful it happened as it did, even with all the fear and destruction. That moment when you came through the chapel door, soaking wet and determined, I'll never forget it as long as I live." Nor will I forget how you looked, Vaughn replied, turning to face her, standing there in your wedding dress, frightened but brave. It was the moment I knew for certain that you were the most precious thing in the world to me, more precious than any treasure, she teased, echoing words he had said to her many times over the years. More precious than all the gold in Colorado, he confirmed, bending to kiss her softly. And becoming more precious with every passing day. As they walked back home, their children running ahead with laughter that echoed through the valley, Vaughn reflected on how the greatest floods in life weren't always those of water. Sometimes they were floods of feeling, of change, of love so powerful it washed away everything that came before. Such floods could destroy, yes, but they could also create something new and beautiful from what remained. For Vaughn and Daisy Turner, the waters that had nearly separated them forever had instead carried them to each other's arms. And in that embrace, they had found not just safety, but a love that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together. Years later, when their children were grown and had children of their own, Vaughn and Daisy would sit on their porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold just as it had on that night of their first kiss. Their hands would still find each other automatically, fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of decades together. And sometimes, when a summer storm would roll in across the mountains, they would stay outside a little longer than wisdom might dictate, letting the first drops of rain touch their upturned faces, a reminder of how sometimes what appears to be disaster can turn out to be the greatest blessing of all.